Louis David Riel was a Canadian politician, a founder of the province of Manitoba, and a political leader of the Métis people of the Canadian prairies. He led two resistance movements against the Canadian government and its first post-Confederation Prime Minister, Sir John A.Macdonald.Riel, sought to preserve Métis rights and culture as the homelands in the Northwest came progressively under the Canadian sphere of influence. Over the decades, he has been made a folk hero by the Francophones, the Catholic nationalists, the Native rights movement, and the New Left student movement. Riel has received more scholarly attention than practically any other figure in Canadian history. His first resistance was the Red River Rebellion of 1869 to 1870. The provisional government established by Riel ultimately negotiated the terms under which the modern province of Manitoba entered the Canadian Confederation. Riel ordered the execution of a Protestant who annoyed him, Thomas Scott, and fled to the United States to escape prosecution. Despite this, he is frequently referred to as the "Father of Manitoba." While a fugitive, he was elected 3 times to the Canadian House of Commons, although he never assumed his seat. During these years, he was frustrated by having to remain in exile despite his growing belief that he was a divinely chosen leader and prophet, a belief which would later resurface and influence his actions. Because of this new religious conviction, Catholic leaders who had supported him before increasingly repudiated him. He married in 1881 while in exile in Montana in the United States. He fathered 3 children. In 1884, Riel was called upon by the Métis leaders in Saskatchewan to articulate the grievances to the Canadian government. Instead, he organized a military resistance that escalated into a military confrontation, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Ottawa used the new rail lines to send in thousands of combat soldiers. It ended in his arrest and conviction for high treason. Rejecting many protests and popular appeals, Prime Minister Macdonald decided to hang him. Riel was seen as a heroic victim by Francophone Canadians. His execution had a lasting negative impact on Canada, polarizing the new nation along ethno-religious lines. Although only a few hundred people were directly affected by the rebellion in Saskatchewan, the long-term result was that the prairie provinces would be controlled by the Anglophones, not the Francophones. An even more important long-term impact was the bitter alienation Francophones across Canada showed and anger against the repression of their countrymen. Riel's historical reputation has long been polarized between portrayals as a dangerous half-insane religious fanatic and rebel against the Canadian nation, or by contrast to heroic rebel who fought to protect his Francophone people from the unfair encroachments of an Anglophone national government. He is increasingly celebrated as a proponent of multiculturalism, although that downplays his primary commitment to Métis nationalism and political independence. Early life. The Red River settlement was a community in Rupert's Land nominally administered by the Hudson's Bay Company, and largely inhabited by First Nations tribes and the Métis, an ethnic group of mixed Cree, Ojibwa, Sioux, French Canadian, Scottish, and English descent. Louis Riel was born there in 1844, near modern Winnipeg, Manitoba, to Louis Riel, Sr. and Julie Lagimodia. Riel was the eldest of 11 children in a locally well-respected family. His father, who was of Franco-Ojibwa Métis descent, had gained prominence in this community by organizing a group that supported Guillaume Sayer, a Métis imprisoned for challenging the HBC's historical trade monopoly. Sayre's eventual release due to agitations by Louis Sr.'s group effectively ended the monopoly, and the name Riel was therefore well known in the Red River area. His mother was the daughter of Jean-Baptiste Lagimodière and Marie-Anne Gabory, one of the earliest white families to settle in the Red River settlement in 1812. The Riels were noted for their devout Catholicism and strong family ties. Riel was first educated by Roman Catholic priests at St. Boniface. At age 13 he came to the attention of Alexandre Taquet, the suffragan bishop of St. Boniface, who was eagerly promoting the priesthood for talented young Métis. In 1858 Taquet arranged for Riel to attend the petit séminaire of the Collège de Montréal, under the direction of the Sulpician order. Descriptions of him at the time indicate that he was a fine scholar of languages, science, and philosophy, but exhibited a frequent and unpredictable moodiness. Following news of his father's premature death in 1864, Riel lost interest in the priesthood and he withdrew from the college in March 1865. For a time he continued his studies as a day student in the convent of the Grey Nuns, but was soon asked to leave following breaches of discipline. He remained in Montreal over a year, living at the home of his aunt, Lucie Riel. Impoverished by the death of his father, Riel took employment as a law clerk in the Montreal office of Rodolphe Laflamme. During this time he was involved in a failed romance with a young woman named Marie-Julie Gernon. This progressed to the point of Riel having signed a contract of marriage, but his fiancée's family opposed her involvement with the Métis, and the engagement was soon broken. Compounding this disappointment, Riel found legal work unpleasant, and by early 1866 he had resolved to leave Canada East. Some of his friends said later that he worked odd jobs in Chicago, Illinois, while staying with poet Louis-Honoré Frechette, and wrote poems himself in the manner of Lamartine, also that he was then for a time employed as a clerk in St. Paul, Minnesota, before returning to the Red River settlement on the 26th of July 1868. Red River Rebellion. The majority population of the Red River had historically been Métis and First Nation people. Upon his return, Riel found that religious, nationalistic, and racial tensions were exacerbated by an influx of Anglophone Protestant settlers from Ontario. The political situation was also uncertain, as ongoing negotiations for the transfer of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada had not addressed the political terms of transfer. Finally, despite warnings to the Macdonald government from Bishop Taquet and the HBC Governor William McTavish that any such activity would precipitate unrest, the Canadian Minister of Public Works, William McDougall, ordered a survey of the area. The arrival on the 20th of August 1869 of a survey party headed by Colonel John Stoughton Dennis increased anxiety among the Métis. The Métis did not possess title to the land, which was in any case laid out according to the seigneurial system rather than in English-style square lots. Riel emerges as a leader. In late August, Riel denounced the survey in a speech, and on the 11th of October 1869, the survey's work was disrupted by a group of Métis that included Riel. This group organized itself as the Métis National Committee on the 16th of October, with Riel as secretary and John Bruce as president. When summoned by the HBC-controlled Council of Assiniboia to explain his actions, Riel declared that any attempt by Canada to assume authority would be contested unless Ottawa had first negotiated terms with the Métis. Nevertheless, the non-bilingual McDougall was appointed the lieutenant governor designate and attempted to enter the settlement on the 2nd of November. McDougall's party was turned back near the American border, and on the same day, Métis led led by Riel, seized Fort Garry. On the 6th of November, Riel invited Anglophones to attend a convention alongside MEAQTI's representatives to discuss a course of action, and on the 1st of December he proposed to this convention a list of rights to be demanded as a condition of union. Much of the settlement came to accept the MEAQTI's point of view, but a passionately pro-Canadian minority began organizing in opposition. Loosely constituted as the Canadian Party, this group was led by John Christian Schultz, Charles Mayer, Colonel John Stoughton Dennis, and a more reticent Major Charles Bolton. MacDougall attempted to assert his authority by authorizing Dennis to raise a contingent of armed men, but the Anglophone settlers largely ignored this call to arms. Schultz, however, attracted approximately 50 recruits and fortified his house and store. Riel ordered Schultz's home surrounded, and the outnumbered Canadians soon surrendered and were imprisoned in Upper Fort Garry. Provisional government hearing of the unrest, Ottawa sent 3 emissaries to the Red River, including HBC Representative Donald Alexander Smith. While they were en route, the MEAQTI's National Committee declared a provisional government on the 8th of December, with Riel becoming its president on the 27th of December. Meetings between Riel and the Ottawa delegation took place on 5 and the 6th of January 1870, but when these proved fruitless, Smith chose to present his case in a public forum. Smith assured large audiences of the government's goodwill in meetings on 19 and the 20th of January, leading Riel to propose the formation of a new convention split evenly between French and English settlers to consider Smith's instructions. On the 7th of February, a new list of rights was presented to the Ottawa delegation, and Smith and Riel agreed to send representatives to Ottawa to engage in direct negotiations on the basis. The provisional government established by Louis Riel published its own newspaper titled New Nation and established the Legislative Assembly of Senebia to pass laws. Canadian resistance and the execution of Scott. Despite the apparent progress on the political front, the Canadian Party continued to plot against the provisional government. However, they suffered a setback on the 17th of February, when 48 men, including Bolton and Thomas Scott, were arrested near Fort Garry. Bolton was tried by a tribunal headed by Ambroise Didime Lepine and sentenced to death for his interference with the provisional government. He was pardoned, but Scott interpreted this as weakness by the MEAQTIs, whom he regarded with open contempt. After Scott repeatedly quarreled with his guards, they insisted that he be tried for insubordination. At his court-martial he was found guilty and was sentenced to death. Riel was repeatedly entreated to commute the sentence, but Riel responded, "I have done 3 good things since I have commenced. I have spared Bolton's life at your instance, I pardoned Gaddy, and now I shall shoot Scott." Scott was executed by firing squad on the 4th of March. Riel's motivations have been the cause of much speculation, but his own justification was that he felt it necessary to demonstrate to the Canadians that the MEAQTIs must be taken seriously. Protestant Canada to take notice, swore revenge, and set up a Canada First movement to mobilize their anger. Creation of Manitoba and the Wolseley expedition. The delegates representing the provisional government departed for Ottawa in March. Although they initially met with legal difficulties arising from the execution of Scott, they soon entered into direct talks with Macdonald and George-Étienne Cartier. An agreement enshrining the demands in the list of rights was quickly reached, and this formed the basis for the Manitoba Act of the 12th of May 1870, which formally admitted Manitoba into the Canadian Confederation. However, the negotiators could not secure a general amnesty for the provisional government, as a means of exercising Canadian authority in the settlement and dissuading American expansionists. A Canadian military expedition under Colonel Garnet Wolseley was dispatched to the Red River. Although the government described it as an errand of peace, Riel learned that Canadian militia elements in the expedition meant to lynch him, and he fled as the expedition approached the Red River. The arrival of the expedition on the 20th of August marked the effective end of the Red River Rebellion. Intervening years. Amnesty question. It was not until the 2nd of September 1870 that the new Lieutenant Governor Adams George Archibald arrived and set about the establishment of civil government. Without an amnesty, and with the Canadian militia beating and intimidating his sympathizers, Riel fled to the safety of the St. Joseph's Mission across the American border in the Dakota Territory. However, the results of the first provincial election in December 1870 were promising for Riel, as many of his supporters came to power. Nevertheless, stress and financial troubles precipitated a serious illness, perhaps a harbinger of his future mental afflictions, that prevented his return to Manitoba until May 1871. The settlement now faced a possible threat from cross-border Fenian raids coordinated by his former associate William Bernard O'Donoghue. Archibald proclaimed a general call to arms on the 4th of October. Companies of armed horsemen were raised, including one led by Riel. When Archibald reviewed the troops in St. Boniface, he made the significant gesture of publicly shaking Riel's hand, signaling that a rapprochement had been effected. This was not to be. When this news reached Ontario, Mayor and members of the Canada First movement whipped up anti-Riel sentiment. With federal elections coming in 1872, Macdonald could ill afford further rift in Quebec-Ontario relations, and so he did not offer an amnesty. Instead, he quietly arranged for Taquet to offer Riel a bribe of $1,000 to remain in voluntary exile. This was supplemented by an additional £600 from Smith for the care of Riel's family. Nevertheless, by late June Riel was back in Manitoba and was soon persuaded to run as a Member of Parliament for the electoral district of Provencher. However, following the early September defeat of Georges-Étienne Cartier in his home riding in Quebec, Riel stood aside so that Cartier, on record as being in favor of amnesty for Riel, might secure a seat in Provencher. Cartier won by acclamation, but Riel's hopes for a swift resolution to the amnesty question were dashed following Cartier's death on the 20th of May 1873. In the ensuing by-election in October 1873, Riel ran unopposed as an independent, although he had again fled, a warrant having been issued for his arrest in September. Lépine was not so lucky. He was captured and faced trial. Riel made his way to Montreal and, fearing arrest or assassination, vacillated as to whether he should attempt to take up his seat in the House of Commons. Edward Blake, the Premier of Ontario, had announced a bounty of $5,000 for his arrest. Famously, Riel was the only Member of Parliament who was not present for the Great Pacific Scandal debate of 1873 that led to the resignation of the Macdonald government in November. Liberal leader Alexander Mackenzie became the interim Prime Minister, and a general election was held in January 1874. Although the Liberals under Mackenzie formed the new government, Riel easily retained his seat. Formally, Riel had to sign a register book at least once upon being elected, and he did so under disguise in late January. He was nevertheless stricken from the rolls following a motion supported by Schultz, who had become the member for the electoral district of Lisgar. Undeterred, Riel prevailed again in the resulting by-election, and although again expelled, his symbolic point had been made and public opinion in Quebec was strongly tipped in his favor. exile and mental illness. During this period, Riel had been staying with priests of the Oblate Order in Plattsburgh, New York, who introduced him to Father Fabien Martin de Barnabé in the nearby village of Keysville. It was here that he received news of Lepine's fate. Following his trial for the murder of Scott, which had begun on the 13th of October 1874, Lepine was found guilty and sentenced to death. This sparked outrage in the sympathetic Quebec press, and calls for amnesty for both Lepine and Riel were renewed. This presented a severe political difficulty for Mackenzie, who was hopelessly caught between the demands of Quebec and Ontario. However, a solution was forthcoming when, acting on his own initiative, the Governor-General Lord Dufferin commuted Lepine's sentence in January 1875. This opened the door for Mackenzie to secure from Parliament an amnesty for Riel, on the condition that he remain in exile for 5 years. During his time of exile, he was primarily concerned with religious rather than political matters. Spurred on by a sympathetic Roman Catholic priest in Quebec, he was increasingly influenced by his belief that he was a divinely chosen leader of the Métis. Modern biographers have speculated that he may have suffered from the psychological condition megalomania. His mental state deteriorated, and following a violent outburst he was taken to Montreal, where he was under the care of his uncle, John Lee, for a few months. But after Riel disrupted a religious service, Lee arranged to have him committed in an asylum in Long Point on 6 March 1876 under the assumed name Louis R. David. Fearing discovery, his doctors soon transferred him to the Beauport Asylum near Quebec City under the name Louis La Rochelle. While he suffered from sporadic or irrational outbursts, he continued his religious writing, composing theological tracts with an admixture of Christian and Judaic ideas. He consequently began calling himself Louis David Riel, prophet of the New World, and he would pray 4 hours, having servants help him to hold his arms in the shape of a cross. Nevertheless, he slowly recovered, and was released from the asylum on 23 January 1878 with an admonition to lead a quiet life. He returned for a time to Keysville, where he became involved in a passionate romance with Evelina Martin de Barnabé, sister of his friend, the Oblate Father Fabien Barnabé. But with insufficient means to propose marriage, Riel returned to the West, hoping that she might follow. However, she decided that she would be unsuited to prairie life, and the correspondence soon ended. Montana and family life. In the fall of 1878, Riel returned to St. Paul, and briefly visited his friends and family. This was a time of rapid change for the Métis of the Red River. The buffalo on which they depended were becoming increasingly scarce. The influx of settlers was ever increasing, and much land was sold to unscrupulous land speculators. Like other Red River Métis who had left Manitoba, Riel headed further west to start a new life. Traveling to the Montana Territory, he became a trader and interpreter in the area surrounding Fort Benton. Observing rampant alcoholism and its detrimental impact on the Native American and Métis people, he engaged in an unsuccessful attempt to curtail the whiskey trade. In 1881, he married Marguerite Monet Belly-Humeur, a young Métis in the fashion of the country, on the 28th of April, an arrangement that was solemnized on the 9th of March 1882. They were to have 3 children, Jean-Louis Marie Angelique, and a boy who was born and died on the 21st of October 1885, less than 1 month before Riel was hanged. Riel soon became involved in the politics of Montana, and in 1882, actively campaigned on behalf of the Republican Party. He brought a suit against a Democrat for rigging a vote. but was then himself accused of fraudulently inducing British subjects to take part in the election. In response, Riel applied for United States citizenship and was naturalized on 16 March 1883. With 2 young children, he had by 1884 settled down and was teaching school at the St. Peter's Jesuit Mission in the Sun River District of Montana.